Hello. I hope you're ready to listen to a strange story. A mysterious case will lead you into a world of ambiguity and the inexplicable. You step into the life of Brian Wells, an ordinary pizza delivery man, but no one could have guessed that he would find himself in a situation full of danger and death. On August 28, 2003, in Erie, Pennsylvania, a bizarre and unexpected case occurred, leaving not only the police, but the entire community bewildered. But today, I will tell you a story unlike any usual case. It is not about a crazy criminal or a typical bank robbery. No. This story delves into the darker corners of the truth, a place where there are things you can't explain, even when every detail is laid bare. Today's story begins with Brian Wells, a 46-year-old pizza delivery man. You wouldn't think that his life could change in such a brief moment, would you? Brian wasn't a standout person. He was just an ordinary pizza delivery man working at Mamma Mia's Pizza, living a simple life. He had nothing special, no grand ambitions, just an ordinary person working a job, living alone with 3 cats, and following habits like everyone else. But on that particular afternoon, his life was about to be thrust into a terrifying situation that no one could have imagined. Imagine, on a beautiful day, you receive a call from a customer requesting a delivery. It feels pretty normal, right? Brian felt the same way. At 1:47 p.m., he received a call to deliver 2 large pizzas to a strange address. That was it. But this address, 8631 Peach Street, led Brian to a remote area, only accessible by a small dirt road, a desolate forest, and particularly a television tower, a place he had no idea would change his life forever. When he arrived, you can imagine Brian thought this was just another delivery. He had no suspicion that in this very moment, a strange plot was waiting for him. You can almost hear his footsteps echoing in the silent forest, and no one in the area knew what was about to happen. And then the unthinkable happened. Brian was strapped with a real bomb collar. A real bomb, not a fake one. It was fastened to his neck with a metal loop, secured with locks and a code. And just like that, Brian's life was no longer his own. At this point, you can feel the suffocating tension surrounding you. Brian was strapped with the bomb collar, and all he could do was follow the instructions set out by the perpetrators. The frightening part was, he didn't know that his life was threatened every minute. Imagine that scene when you realize you are being controlled by invisible forces and your life is now measured in seconds. Brian didn't know he was being exploited, dragged into a much larger plot. After being strapped with the bomb, he had no choice but to continue following the instructions given to him. Time was quickly running out, and the bomb on his neck was a constant reminder of the lurking danger. But an ordinary man like Brian couldn't understand that he was standing in the middle of a complex and dangerous criminal network. At 2:20 p.m., Brian arrived at a PNC bank about 2 miles from the delivery location. He entered the bank holding a white envelope with a peculiar demand. Collect the employees with the access code to the vault and work quickly to fill the bag with $250,000. You have only 15 minutes. He also showed them the bomb around his neck. But what was strange was that despite committing a bank robbery, he remained so calm, to the point where the bank employees felt something was off. You may wonder, did Brian know what he was doing, or was he really a victim in a game he couldn't escape? Either way, he only received $8,702, a small amount compared to the requested sum. After receiving the money, he calmly left the bank, even sucking on a lollipop from the counter as he walked out. He drove off, as if everything were perfectly normal. But was everything truly as normal as it seemed? And then, just a few minutes later, he was arrested by the police. The investigating officers initially couldn't understand why Brian was acting this way. Why was he so calm, especially while having a bomb strapped to his neck? And why didn't he try to remove the bomb instead of just standing still and watching everything unfold? When detained, Brian quickly informed the police about the bomb on his neck and kept calling for help. "Why isn't anyone trying to take this off me? I don't have much time. It's going to explode." Time was running out, and the bomb began beeping rapidly. You can feel the tension in the air as if every second was a countdown to a tragic end. And then, at 3:18 p.m., the beeping became faster, and the bomb exploded. Brian fell to the ground, and his death was a huge shock to everyone. But was this just an accident, or was there something darker hiding behind the death of an innocent man? The investigators still couldn't definitively determine whether Brian was part of the plot or just a victim in a larger criminal conspiracy. But one thing was certain: this bank robbery would forever remain one of the greatest unsolved mysteries, and the answers might never come.
The police arrived shortly after the bomb exploded, but all they could do was witness what had already transpired, unable to take further action. As they gathered evidence, strange details about the case gradually began to emerge, making the story even more complicated and harder to understand. You sit here, listening, and can't help but wonder, is this a typical bank robbery or a deadly game carefully orchestrated? When the investigators arrived at the scene, the notes found in Brian Wells's car revealed something peculiar, a series of instructions he had to follow. These notes were unlike ordinary instructions. They contained specific directions on how to go to various locations around the city to collect passwords, clues, and keys, all related to disarming the bomb on Brian's neck. You can imagine what he went through, as everything unfolded like a sequence of instructions with no way out. Each piece of this story becomes more complicated as investigators discover more strange clues. The police began to suspect that Brian might have been used, or worse, that he may have known something that they couldn't anticipate. But the big question remained unanswered. Was he an accomplice, or just a victim? Time went on, and you feel like you're walking down a path full of uncertainties. While the investigators continued searching for clues, someone named William A. Rothstein suddenly entered the investigation. Rothstein, a tall man with mechanical engineering skills, caught everyone's attention. Just weeks after Brian's death, Rothstein called the police and reported finding a frozen body in his freezer. The body was that of James Rawdon, the boyfriend of Marjorie Deal Armstrong, who had been shot and killed. The story was getting stranger and stranger. Rothstein, despite reporting the body to the police, had a peculiar connection to Deal Armstrong, who would later become one of the main suspects in the case. When investigators looked into Rothstein, they discovered that he had surprising mechanical skills, which led them to suspect that he might have played a role in the construction of the bomb that killed Brian. You can imagine the confusion in the investigators' minds, as everything seemed to point in various directions without any clear conclusions. But even as the suspicions grew, other strange details continued to surface. Rothstein's house was just a few minutes' walk from Brian Wells's last pizza delivery spot, and a nearby public phone booth was used to make the pizza order call. Everything seemed to be strangely connected, yet there wasn't enough evidence to make any concrete conclusions. You begin to sense the investigators' frustration as everything seemed to fall into a deep, endless pit where the clues only led them in circles with no way out. Rothstein passed away from cancer in the summer of 2004 before he could face any charges. Throughout the investigation, many believed that Rothstein was the true mastermind behind the entire plot. But was the truth really that simple? Certainly not. The story became even more complex when another figure entered the picture: Marjorie Deal Armstrong. Marjorie Deal Armstrong, a woman known in Erie for her sharp intelligence but also for her severe psychological issues, proved to be someone capable of plotting meticulously and coldly. She suffered from mental disorders, including bipolar disorder and paranoia, and these traits formed a complex and unpredictable character. In the past, she had admitted to killing her boyfriend and had a violent history. She had a strange relationship with Rothstein, having been engaged to him twice. She also admitted to killing James Rodden, her boyfriend, and hiding his body in Rothstein's freezer. But her actions didn't stop there. Diehl Armstrong later admitted to the FBI that she had provided the kitchen timer for the bomb collar that Brian wore. She also revealed that she was less than a mile from the bank where the robbery occurred when it took place. But the most suspicious detail came from the testimony of Kenneth Barnes, another figure in this case. Barnes, a former TV repairman turned drug dealer, testified that Diehl Armstrong was the true mastermind. He claimed she needed money to kill her father, someone she believed was wasting the wealth she hoped to inherit. What's even stranger is that Barnes asserted that Brian Wells had been involved in the robbery a month before it happened, and that he had agreed to help only for one reason: money. And then, as you sit back and reflect on everything, you can't help but ask, was Wells really part of the conspiracy, or was he simply a pawn in this deadly game? Everything feels like a play, but missing some key pieces to tie it all together. And the biggest question remains unanswered.
With each new clue, the story of Brian Wells and the collar bomb bank robbery becomes more complicated. Despite the investigators having collected a significant amount of evidence, the biggest question still lingers: who was truly behind all of this? Once again, you feel unable to look away from the details, as each answer only opens up more mysteries. You sense the tension rising, like a slow-moving film that won't let you stop watching, and you wonder, could all of this be part of a bigger conspiracy than you ever imagined? As the police begin to verify the information and revisit the relationships between the suspects, you'll be surprised to realize that this case was not just a failed bank robbery. It contains a network of people involved, each with their own reasons, their own goals, but all linked together by an odd thread. And it is within these threads that you'll find the answer to the question: was Brian Wells an entirely innocent victim, or just a part of a well-planned conspiracy? The story continues with Kenneth Barnes, a figure you've heard of in the previous parts. Barnes, a former TV repairman turned drug dealer, has now become an important character in this story. It was Barnes who confirmed that Diehl Armstrong was the true mastermind behind the plot. But the interesting part is that at that point, investigators still didn't know the full extent of the relationships and motivations behind this case. Specifically, Barnes revealed that Wells may have known about the robbery before it happened, a month before the bomb was strapped to his neck. When you hear this, you can't help but wonder, was Wells truly part of the plan, or had he been forced to participate with no other choice? This becomes even murkier when Barnes admits that Wells might have thought the bomb was fake, just a tool to mislead the police. But when he arrived at the television tower and realized the bomb was real, it was probably too late. Like everyone else, Wells must have been pulled into a criminal network that he couldn't escape from. The instructions he received, the clear directions from the mastermind, all led him to take the next steps. But throughout this journey, one question continues to haunt you. Did Wells truly understand what was happening, or was he just a pawn being used in a terrifying game? When the police interrogated Barnes, he revealed that Wells had agreed to help with the bank robbery solely for financial reasons. Imagine that, a pizza delivery man, living what seemed like an ordinary life, drawn into a major criminal case just for a simple reason like money. But is that enough to explain what happened to Wells? The answer might lie in his choices, the steps he took, the decisions he unknowingly made that led to his death. But there's still something that remains unclear. Why would a bank robbery require the use of a collar bomb? Why not just use a gun or a conventional weapon to threaten the bank employees? Why use such a complex bomb that had to be carefully constructed? This is a question the investigators still cannot answer. One hypothesis they proposed was that the bomb was not just a tool to force Wells into the robbery, but part of a bigger conspiracy designed to create a crisis situation, a shock for the entire community. And perhaps only Diehl Armstrong knew the true purpose behind it all. As the investigators continue to follow the clues, they uncover another odd detail. One of the people involved in the case, Jessica Hoopsick, a sex worker with connections to both Barnes and Wells. Hoopsick testified that she knew Wells and had even hung out with him at Kenneth Barnes' house. This only complicates the case further, as the unclear relationships between the characters slowly come to light. And so you begin to realize that this bank robbery is not just a simple case. It's a network of relationships, inexplicable events, and a deadly game that Brian Wells couldn't escape from. But was he really an entirely innocent victim? Or did he get involved in a conspiracy that he couldn't back out of? This question remains unanswered and may forever remain an unsolved mystery.
As you continue to follow the story of Brian Wells, an ordinary pizza delivery man, you begin to feel that everything is heading toward an inevitable conclusion. Whether he wanted it or not, his life had been pulled into a case far bigger than anything anyone could have imagined. The police are continuing their investigation, and new details are constantly emerging, bringing the story closer to the truth, but at the same time, making everything even more confusing. Now, the story is no longer just about a failed bank robbery. What's more concerning is the emergence of complicated relationships, people whose roles in the case you can't easily determine. The deeper you investigate, the more you realize that Marjorie Diehl Armstrong is the true mastermind behind everything. But is she the only one? The answer seems unclear. After Brian Wells' death, the investigators began connecting the details and clues they had gathered. Interviews, evidence collected, and testimonies from those involved seemed to form a more complete picture of what had truly happened. But every answer only left them more confused, as it opened up new questions that they couldn't resolve. While the investigators were looking into things, they couldn't help but notice one strange detail. Kenneth Barnes, one of the main people involved in the case, revealed that Brian Wells had actually known about the robbery before it happened. This was not something new, but when you hear this, you can't help but feel like something is being hidden. Was Wells truly an accomplice in this plot, or was he just a victim dragged into a conspiracy he couldn't escape from? This question has never been clearly answered. Barnes testified that Wells had known about the robbery a month before it happened, and that he had even agreed to participate in the robbery, for one simple reason: money. But does that really make sense? An ordinary pizza delivery man agreeing to join such a complex scheme just for money? It seems like something is being concealed, and you can't help but feel that Wells was forced to participate, or worse, dragged into a game he couldn't control. One question the investigators couldn't overlook was, why use a bomb collar? Why not just use a common weapon like a gun or a knife to threaten the bank employees? This is a question that even experts couldn't answer definitively. Collar bombs, especially the type Wells wore, are a rare and complex weapon. It's a metal ring intricately designed with locks and codes, a device that only someone with mechanical expertise could build. And the strangest thing is, it didn't just threaten Wells's life, it created a tense situation for everyone present in the bank. You wonder, was this bomb the only tool to force Wells into the robbery, or was there something else behind it? The investigators continued working tirelessly, sifting through clues and evidence to uncover the truth.
But the deeper they got into the case, the more they felt stuck. Every time they thought they had found the answer, a new clue emerged, complicating everything further. The main suspects, like Diehl Armstrong and Barnes, all had their own reasons, their own motives, and the story began to feel more like a game of scheming and manipulation, where everyone had their own agendas, but no one could be sure they weren't being exploited. What makes this case even stranger is the emergence of details that no one could explain. Jessica Hoopsick, a woman with ties to Barnes and Wells, testified that she knew Wells and had even hung out with him at Kenneth Barnes's house. This only adds to the confusion as the relationships between the suspects become even more tangled. Hoopsick was a sex worker, and she claimed that she had met Wells before the robbery took place. This not only complicates the case, but also raises suspicions about the relationship between Wells and those involved. All these relationships, contradictory testimonies, and incomplete pieces of the puzzle make the story more difficult to understand. One thing is for sure, Brian Wells was not the mastermind, but was he truly an innocent victim? Or had he actively participated in this plot? Could he have been a pawn dragged into a dangerous game he couldn't escape from? These questions remain unanswered and may forever be an unsolved mystery. As you sit back and reflect on all that has happened, you can't help but feel that there is still much more to be revealed. Perhaps only those involved know the full truth. But one thing you can be certain of, this collar bomb bank robbery is one of the most bizarre and mysterious cases in criminal history.
The story of Brian Wells and the collar bomb bank robbery is increasingly heading into a dead end, but every detail feels like an incomplete piece of a larger puzzle. You feel yourself getting more and more drawn into the confusion of each event, with each clue raising new doubts. The deeper you go, the more you feel like you're lost in a maze with no way out. But it's undeniable that every step of the investigation is opening up more bizarre and contradictory details. One of the key figures in this story is Marjorie Diehl Armstrong, a woman who appears intelligent but carries with her complex psychological issues. She isn't just the mastermind behind the case, she also has deep ties to William Rothstein, the man who discovered the body of her boyfriend, James Roden, in his freezer. A question that everyone is asking is, why does a case that seems so simple involve such complex relationships and motives that are hard to understand? For Diehl Armstrong, everything was meticulously calculated. Not only was she sharp-minded, but she was also unafraid to use manipulation to achieve her goals. However, her scheming wasn't limited to just building the collar bomb. It also involved violent acts from her past. She admitted to killing James Roden and having Rothstein hide the body. But the most bizarre thing is that she provided the kitchen timer for the bomb, an action that raises even more questions about her role in the conspiracy. Though Diehl Armstrong was convicted as the mastermind behind the case, she may not have been the only one behind everything. Kenneth Barnes, who cooperated with the police, also plays a significant role in this case. Barnes, a man who had once been involved in drug activities, testified that she had wanted to kill her father to inherit his wealth, and that motive was the reason she needed money to carry out this plan. Barnes also stated that Wells had participated in the robbery to get money, and when he realized the bomb was real, it was too late. But when you hear this testimony, you can't help but feel suspicious. Wells, an ordinary pizza delivery man, why would he participate in such a complex crime conspiracy? Was he truly an accomplice, or was he just a victim who was lured into a game he couldn't escape? Each clue brings you closer to an answer, but it also makes you realize that what happened is much more complicated than you thought. Moreover, there is another strange detail that cannot be overlooked. Jessica Hoopsick, a sex worker, was connected to both Barnes and Wells. She testified that she had met Wells at Kenneth Barnes's house before the robbery took place, and even claimed she had hooked up with him. These relationships only make the case more complex and harder to understand. Could it all have been a staged game, a plot full of manipulation that Dial Armstrong, Rothstein, and others had created together? While the investigators continue their search for answers, small but significant details begin to reveal themselves, like pieces of a puzzle that isn't quite finished. One of the strange aspects of this case is that Brian Wells was tasked with carrying out the bank robbery without knowing he would have to face the dangerous bomb caller. Everyone involved in this scheme had their own reasons for participating, but none of them could predict the outcome. And throughout the investigation, the biggest question remains: was Wells truly an accomplice or just an innocent victim? The investigation became increasingly difficult as figures like Barnes and Hoopsick continued to give contradictory testimonies. Those involved in the case all shared one thing in common: they each had their own reasons to hide the truth. And the truth remains like an unsolved riddle. The tangled details, the complex relationships, and the hard-to-understand motives have created a case full of strange twists that only those directly involved could truly understand. As you go deeper into the story, you feel yourself lost in everything. The signs, the clues, and the testimonies lead you into a whirlwind with no end. The story of Brian Wells and the collar bomb bank robbery is not just a simple case. It's a difficult puzzle that no matter how hard you try, the truth always remains hidden in the shadows. But will you be able to find the answer to this riddle? The answer may already be in the hands of those involved, but they refuse to open up. And in the end, you wonder, will this case forever remain a mystery with no solution, or will one day the truth be revealed? But until then, this mystery will persist, and the story of Brian Wells will always be one of the strangest cases in criminal history.
This story, with its layers of complexity, is not easy to conclude. Every time you think you're close to the light at the end of the tunnel, new details emerge, contradictory testimonies arise, forcing you to pause and reflect. Indeed, this case is not a puzzle with a simple solution. And even though the investigators have worked tirelessly for years, there are still too many unanswered questions. One thing you can feel as this story unfolds is its strangeness. Brian Wells, an ordinary pizza delivery man, became the center of a deadly plot where, despite his will, he was drawn into a criminal web that he couldn't escape. The more you reflect on the events that happened, the more you realize that not everything happens as we might think. Marjorie Dial Armstrong, a woman with sharp intelligence but deep psychological issues, was the mastermind behind this robbery. But strangely, she was not the only one involved. William Rothstein, with his mechanical skills, played a significant role in creating the bomb that Brian Wells had to wear around his neck. And Kenneth Barnes, with his suspicious testimony, revealed that Wells may have known about the robbery before it happened. This story, not only complicated, but also full of question marks about the truth, seems increasingly murky. Although all of these characters had their reasons for participating in the conspiracy, there's one thing you can't overlook.
Wells didn't appear to be the mastermind. He wasn't a criminal. He was a victim, dragged into a plan that he couldn't control. And perhaps that's what makes this case more unique and strange than any other. Was Wells an accomplice, or was he simply a victim deceived into this game? These questions still remain, with no clear answer, and perhaps they will never be solved. As the case gradually reaches its conclusion, one thing you'll notice: those involved all have their own reasons for hiding the truth. But what will the truth ultimately be? The characters in this story, with their complex relationships, will never open up and reveal everything. And no matter how thoroughly the case was investigated, it will still remain a mystery. In the end, the conclusion of this story is not a clear one. You might feel that this story isn't over, and perhaps it will never end. Despite the investigators doing their best, the truth remains hidden in the shadows. A story where no matter how much you delve into it, the ambiguity still lingers. And so the story of Brian Wells will forever remain one of the strangest, most mysterious, and unsolvable cases in history. The truth may never be revealed, and all the questions will remain unanswered. You can imagine yourself sitting in the dark, thinking about this case, the people involved, and the unsolved questions. Perhaps one day, the truth will surface. But until then, this case will forever remain a mystery, a story you can't forget. And so the story ends here. But perhaps the truth about Brian Wells and the Color Bomb Bank robbery will forever be a puzzle without an answer, an open-ended mystery.